We've talked already about the scope of functions themselves. Basically, a function must be defined before it is called in some code, the same way a variable had to be created before it was used. However, what about the variables we use inside functions? What are their scopes? This code tests that out. Instead of returning something from the inside of currency amount, it instead creates a variable called result string and gives that the value that should be returned. Result string is created in each individual branch of this conditional, so we can guarantee that once this code has run, once the function has been called, result string has been created. If we tried to print it here at the bottom of the function, it would have a value. Our question, though, is whether or not it exists outside of the function. So the way this code runs is it runs lines 1 and 2, defines the function currency amount, skips the body until it's called, then runs line 13, which calls that function. It calls it with the arguments GBP and 5. That sends execution into that function. Currency was GBP, so it did not equal JPY, it did not equal USD, but it did equal GBP. And so line 8 will run, which creates a variable called result string and sets it equal to a string containing the symbol for a British pound and a string for the amount. So in other words, just pound 5. Because that branch already ran, the else doesn't run, and now we're at the end of the function again. So it returns back to the main program. Line 13 is done, so the computer runs line 14, which says to print the variable result string. Now we saw that result string was created when we ran line 8. However, when we try to print result string, we get an error, specifically a name error, and it says that the variable named result string is not defined. That was the same error we would get if we skipped line 13 altogether and just tried to print result string in the first place, without ever declaring that variable. But we created result string, right? Right there inside the function. So why doesn't it work? Well, the reason why is that the scope of any variable created inside a function ends when the function ends. Result string was created on line 8 because that's which branch of that conditional actually ran. And so its scope would be from there until the end of the function. Line 14 is outside that function, and so it's not inside that scope. This is actually the reason why we have those return statements. Anything created inside the function is not accessible to the main application. Return statement is a way for the function to send something back out to the main program. But because the variable result string was created inside the function and it wasn't returned, printing result string generates an error. This is the first major exception we've encountered to our general rule that the scope of a variable is the remainder of the program's execution. Variables created inside functions only exist inside those functions and only until the function is done running. If we called currency amount 2 different times, the second time it would be as if result string was never created in the first place. It would have no initial value. In this way, functions really are like little programs. The scope of a variable is the remainder of the program, and a function is like its own little program, so the scope of a variable created inside of a function is the remainder of the function. Note that this doesn't interfere with the scope of other variables outside the function. Running a function doesn't terminate other variables' scopes. So if we created a variable before calling currency amount, that variable would still be available after currency amount was done running.